Welcome to the Journal podcast from the Chartered Insurance Institute, a place for thought-provoking discussion from the world of insurance and beyond. I'm Michael Bond, Social Media and Production Executive at the Chartered Insurance Institute. Today, we're here to talk about a particular niche in insurance, political violence and terrorism insurance. We'll be discussing what it is, the risks that it covers, the individuals and businesses who may take out this type of cover, and much, much more. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by James Thomas, Head of Specialty, and Akash Singh, Senior Exposure Analyst, both from Antares. Gents, thanks for joining me today.
Pleasure.
So to begin with, could you just tell us a bit about yourself? Akash, we'll start with you.
Sure. So I'm a Senior Exposure Analyst, work at Antares. I've been in the industry for 4.5 years now, coming up to 5 years. And I've been looking at multiple lines of businesses, varying ones over the last 4.5 years, but specifically looking at political violence and terror. So this is something that's really interesting to me. I feel like the changing dynamic is ever so changing, for example. So I'm really interested in talking about this today.
Fantastic. And you, James?
Yeah, welcome. Thank you. So James Thomas, Head of Specialty. My insurance career has just actually ticked over the 15-year mark. And I started straight out of university on AIG's graduate underwriting program, where I was underwriting credit, essentially financial risk emanating from the construction and infrastructure segments. And then from there, in 2015, I joined Antares, initially as an underwriter, and then became a class underwriter for the political and financial risk account circa 7 years ago. And then in 2024, I took on a wider specialty role. And specialty is one of those kind of classic nebulous insurance terms. Lloyd's and the London market is a specialized insurance market, but specialty within that is a fairly esoteric collection of non-property, non-casualty classes where you're covering really pretty technical underlying assets and or coverages. So for us at Antares, it is political and financial risk, my background, political violence and terror, what we're here to talk about today, and then also accident and health.
Fantastic. Great experience from both of you. This will be a fantastic conversation. So just to start us off then, could you give us a definition of what political violence and terrorism insurance is and some of the key aspects that it covers?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to pick that up. So, I'll try my best to try and provide a relatively succinct definition, but terror and political violence to me is a collection of underlying products which are designed to protect the balance sheets of asset owners, both from a series of different political linked events, both from physical damage, but also those assets' ability to generate cash flows and ultimately a return. And when we talk about the events that we're covering, we generally think about them as following this sort of continuum of different events. And you can start anywhere along the continuum, but generally speaking, I think it's probably easiest if we start from a sort of localized and an unstructured basis. So you have things such as SRCC, commonly referred to as SRCC, which is strikes, riots, and civil commotions. Essentially, localized public disturbances, civil unrest, and, could be workers' protests and things like that. Then you go up the coordination scale to things such as terrorism. And terrorism is defined as acts carried out by individuals or groups that are, principally motivated by political, religious, or ideological factors. And then you move from terror to much broad-based sort of extensive conflagration. So we think of insurrection, rebellion, civil war, and ultimately war. And if we perhaps try and give some examples, if we think about what's going on in the Middle East at the moment, the important thing is to remember that all of these events are kind of intrinsically linked. And they're all correlated. So what's going on in the Middle East is what we would clearly define as war. So war between principally Iran and then also the US and Israel, but also implications for the GCC. But one of our concerns is this resultant instability is creating a security vacuum, which may well be filled by increased terrorism incidents. So as Iran activates their various proxies across the region. And in a similar manner, although indirectly, we're also concerned about SRCC as a result, because the straits as of the 16th of July are still shut. And there's a real risk that that's going to export a very real wave of structural inflation, supply side inflation, which we know is a key cause of declining real incomes and a sort of catalyst for unrest. So those hopefully gives you a bit of a feel for the types of things that we're covering.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's quite a bit in there, isn't there?
Yeah, it's a broad continuum, right?
Yeah, no, and really interesting stuff though as well. And something that I suppose that definition or that idea of what you consider maybe terrorism as well has changed over the years. And I always assumed it was quite a long-term insurance that's been around for ages. But at the same time, where did it start from, and is it changed since maybe the IRA days, like sort of the 80s and 90s to now?
So I think there's many different events that have sort of spanned over the last, let's say, for example, century. Terrorism is not exactly new. Right? We're talking over a century long, but it really did start on the 9/11, the 2001 attacks, right? So we have 1992, we have the Baltic Exchange attack with the IRA, which is a bomb with the truck bomb. And then we move on now to the 9/11 attacks, where we're looking at over around 56 billion losses, right? This is absolutely massive. But at the time of this event, there wasn't exactly terrorism cover, right? Not standalone terrorism cover. So a lot of the insurance losses actually fell on the reinsurers at the time, right? So now as we come towards the 20th century, along the 20th century, we're looking in 2020s and onwards, now we actually have standalone cover for terrorism because of the fact that if the event like that happened again and it occurred again, we want to make sure that everyone in the Lloyd's market is actually covered. And whoever is actually insuring their buildings and infrastructures is covered for terrorism insurance. And one thing to specify on this is when we're looking at, we're looking at the types of events that could happen, but then we also have to look at the coverages. So we're also looking at buildings. So for example, physical damage. So we've got property damage and we also got contents. And then we're also looking at business interruption. From where we was looking at, where James has actually said excellently in terms of talking about SRCC, insurrection and war, now we are seeing a bit more in terms of loss of attraction, denial of access, as well as active assailant. So there was one event, which was the 2017 Las Vegas mass shooting, right? Which is the deadliest mass shooting of all time in US history, which about 58 people passed away on the day. And because of that event, it was really hard to determine what was, when they were investigated at the time, what was actually the cause? What was the motivation? As James said, there is a motivation that you have to think about. Is it ideological? Is it religious motivation? But it was extremely difficult to determine that. And because of that, arose active assailant and active shooter. So we are now seeing a change of dynamics. Terrorism will always be there and it always will be prevalent, but we are now seeing a bit more in terms of maybe sublimits for policies that's based on denial of access, loss of attraction, active assailant.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, looking at business interruption and property insurance, probably back then, you're right, it might have been something that was sort of coupled in there. It might have been quite a broad wording potentially. But now, like a bit in a similar way to cyber, where cyber was probably something in addition to it, now it has its very own special place for a very large like sort of attacks as well that happen. It can't just be I'll bundle it up, I'll pop it into your general business interruption coverage. It has to have its own area. So, and after all those things, all those shootings, all those the geopolitical tensions that are going on at the moment, it makes a lot of sense that there would be a specific cover to cover those very high impactful and hopefully rare events, but you never know, things raising up over time. And touching on the political landscape as well right now, what is the current state of it? And do you find that there's, say, it's high demand at the moment? And what has been the evolution, the change from, let's say, back when it was more of a maybe more broadly worded policies, or it was one of those things that was part of your business interruption, part of your property insurance, to now being very much in its own area?
Yeah, I mean, we perhaps touch on war a bit later on because it's very pertinent to what's going on at the moment. But just we think about the evolution of the product, we started off throughout following 9/11, as Akash says, that was really the catalyst for the standalone product to come out of property, right? So when we think about how the product has evolved, so much of the early 2000s, we were very worried about these big scale coordinated attacks. And that was obviously started with 9/11, but it also was followed, we had things like the Madrid bombs in 2000, train bombs in 2004. We had 7/7 here in London in 2005. And that was the predominant way of which terrorist attacks were carried out. But over the ensuing years, you've had much more stringent legislation and controls around chemicals and the constituent components to essentially to bomb making. You've also got much more intensive sort of interrogation and policing to make sure that intelligence-based policing which has meant that terrorism tactics have pivoted. So they've pivoted to more sort of localized, whether that's knife attacks, whether that's shootings, whether that's improvised explosives, use of vehicles as well. So as Akash said, the market has had to evolve. Whilst principally, the main sort of heads of cover are physical damage and they are business interruption, providing indemnity for the inability to access your building, the loss of footfall as a result of something, an attack in the immediate vicinity, have become really, really important. They've been codified under composite coverages, as we said, active shooter, active assailant, those sorts of things. But if the early 2000s was sort of characterized by that, I mean, the last 10 years, we've seen, yes, we've had the return to real sort of continental wars, but we've also had a really pronounced rise in SRCC. Mm-hmm. So if we think about, how do we synthesize? Why is that? Well, the way I kind of think about it is, ever since the global financial crisis and then also magnified by COVID, sovereign balance sheets are really under a lot of pressure and politicians are facing a lot of, very difficult choices around spending principally, right? And then when you overlay the fact that there's been a real mushrooming in asset values as interest rates have been very, very low, income inequality, wealth inequality, and general sort of disillusionment around, cost of living and things like that have never, ever been higher. And it's creating this really sort of, no wonder we've had the real sort of growth and propagation of populism because, we've got the perfect sort of background to that. And that's certainly been aided in many ways propagated by things such as social media. So we're seeing these fault lines societally, which are, that are increasingly rupturing more frequently. And it's really beginning to open insurers and reinsurers' eyes to the kind of the insurability of SRCC risks within property or risk programs. And it's also forging a real specialism in the PV market. And risk managers within corporates are increasingly sort of valuing the full suite of PV products, not just your standard all risk plus bolting on terror, but also bolting on SRC and also bolting on war as well.
Fantastic. Yeah, seems like there's a lot there that insurers have to respond to and think about, especially over that time. It's
evolved. Yeah, it really has evolved.
Yeah,
I think just on that case, I think with SRCC, we've now becoming more prevalent in today's society and economically, we are starting to think of ways in insurance, in the Lloyd's market, of how do we model SRCC, right? I think when Lloyd's are sending out their realistic disaster scenarios or syndicates and asking people to populate the figures in terms of what would a 2-ton bomb blast be on Rockefeller and also One World Trade Center for terrorism, now we are starting to think of how do we do this for SRCC? How can we model SRCC in terms of aggregations? So there are many vendors out in the market that are starting to think of these type of ways of how do we approach this, but it's now becoming more, obviously because it's more prevalent, it's difficult to model this stochastically and probabilistically. Mm. So if there is a riot, let's say for example George Floyd riots 2020, right? We are not looking at one state that there was riots at. These are multiple states. Mm. So how can you model one state and not even neighboring towns, but states that's far across from another one? Right, for not even tens of miles, but hundreds of miles away from it. So you really have to think outside the box and think of the shoes of, okay, if we were to model this, do we apply like probable maximum losses? How far in terms of the range and the distance? So it's interesting to see the landscape of how we will look at it in the next couple of years. Obviously, we are looking at it from how we insure it in today's market, but I think it is, ever-changing. I mean, we are seeing this definitely.
And I think it's helpful to contextualize these with some examples, right? So on the SRCC side, in late 2019 and 2020, the spark in Chile, for example, was increasing the government increased the cost of the metro. And that sort of was the catalyst for mass protests around income inequality, around cost of living, around all sorts of societal issues. And that resulted in over $2 billion worth of damage to the property market. So huge levels of damage. Similarly, literally a year later in South Africa, you had mass protests, again, over availability of housing, many of the same sort of income inequality issues. And that was $1 billion of market. So these are significant events. Mm. And so often with the insurance industry, how do products evolve? How do you get newer products? Well, okay, it's either in response to what I would label the genuine ingenuity of humankind. So we think about the growth in cyber, as you said, we think about the growth in, environmental carbon products. But more often than not, you have a sort of confluence of events. They might be natural catastrophes, or they could be anthropogenic. They crystallize in a way that hitherto you hadn't thought kind of possible as underwriters and insurers. And that suddenly creates an immediate codification and evolution of the market. And that's kind of what's happened in the property or risk market, initially with terror as a vector, as mass terror, and then more recently as SRCC, and then now increasingly war as well.
Absolutely. And something that just occurred to me as you were speaking there, these different locations as well, so South Africa, United States, they're going to have very different profiles that you'll have to assess the risk for. There's going to probably be different factors. And then the UK as well, the different laws, the different, maybe even things in America where they have access to firearms more easily than they do in the UK. So a factor to be taken into consideration. So it's really clear that there's not just one size fits all for this. You have to assess it on almost a case by case, area by area, situation by situation basis. So I can imagine that being extremely interesting to look at. Anyway, what types of businesses, organizations, or even individuals, if that's the case, would be taking out this type of coverage typically?
So I would say property owners and also the property owners who they are lending to as well. So as we see from the global financial crisis, they obviously are lending a lot of money across as well. So we are seeing people basically who are owners of these assets. And then we are moving away from owners of assets and we're looking at actual buildings itself. So like universities, NGOs, embassies, any infrastructure out there that you think in a risky place, all right, we need to insure for terrorism. We need to insure for SRCC. We need to insure for war. And now obviously it's becoming in places where in rural and urban areas where you wouldn't think maybe 10 years ago that there wouldn't be a riot. Now there's a chance it could happen tomorrow. And obviously, like you mentioned, geopolitical tensions out there, right? We are now sort of thinking outside the box and, okay, economically, right, in developing and undeveloping countries, right? What is the comparison here? Undeveloping countries, if there was a riot, obviously people, for example, have nothing to lose. So in that, what does that look like? That increases the rate of violent protests. So we are seeing it from that stance.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the main users of the product, as a rough rule of thumb, terrorism and PV is generally included in personal lines, but from a commercial perspective, it's often typically excluded, right? So businesses, as Akash said, of all sizes where you've got a material amount of assets, and that relative test is going to be relative to the size of the business. But these events, we hope, are fairly, low frequency, but very high severity. And those events have the potential to put sort of terminal strain on the ability of these companies to continue to trade and continue to ultimately remain solvent. So businesses of all sizes, from small SMEs right up to, big multinational corporates with assets all over the world, right up to billion-dollar real estate managers, all use the product. So it's a real suite of different insureds. And in terms of one key differentiator when it comes to underwriting this line of business is, unlike traditional property, where many of these sort of perils are natural and therefore fortuitous in how they manifest, these instances are deliberate. So we have to be very careful when we underwrite. When we are underwriting, we spend, and our PV team spend a huge amount of time doing due diligence, both initially at a macro level. They look at the surrounding regional and thinking, well, what's the chances of becoming embroiled in war? So we think about what's going on in the Middle East, Russia, Ukraine, India, Pakistan. We then drill down to the specific asset level, right? And, as we're going through those steps, we look at the country level and we think, how stable is the country? Has there been uprisings? When are the next elections? How long has the incumbent been in? What's the role of the military? And then we go down to the specific asset level and we think about, both the immediate area, because from a war perspective, you're seeing at the moment, anywhere near a US forward base is at a higher risk. And similarly, we think, well, what's the actual occupation of this asset, right? Because when it comes to SRCC, hugely emotive assets such as government buildings or banks or retail assets are generally the first to get targeted. A big industrial asset miles outside of town, that's where a lot of the populace works, is relatively speaking lower risk. But the total inverse of that's true for war because, these key strategic infrastructure assets, utilities, or key fiscal contributors, it might be oil and gas, or key sources to the war machine of an economy, they're the first to get targeted. So that's why country by country, asset by asset, we've really got to drill in and use and leverage our underwriters' experience, but also we use third-party data sets as well. So it is an intensive underwriting class.
it sounds it.
Just to add on to that, actually, it's specifically talking about Chile in 2019 with the riots there. And you mentioned about like occupancy. So, for example, like retailers, it's actually really interesting to think about in terms of the occupancy of what was actually targeted in the Chile riots. And when looking at the facts and statistics, it was actually just over a third of the losses, which was 3 billion, was actually retail.
Wow, yeah.
Right. So if we look at it from that stance, then that also then filters onto exposure management, underwriting, and then we can help underwriters in the sense of, okay, what does your portfolio look like? Is there more retailers compared to other occupancy types, right? And then if that's the case, then we can see, okay, maybe in the next year we can change the way we underwrite ever so slightly to start doing less retailers because we know they're more at risk when it comes to SRCC.
Akash and the exposure management team are absolutely critical to they're an extension of the underwriting team, and there's exposure management throughout lines of business from a Lloyd's perspective and all insurers is critical, but this probably more than most is absolutely integral to having a sophisticated exposure management and people really who can give you that data back.
Oh, brilliant. Well, I'm glad to see how both teams will work together. That's really
symbiosis.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
If there was a business that operated within two different countries, so let's say they were based in the UK, let's say it's a coffee company, and they've got a factory in South America somewhere or Africa, wherever they get in their beans from, and an attack happens on that particular location abroad, but they're a UK-based company. Does there have to be additional factors taken into account when they're not just, we're just in the UK, they have to assess UK risk, they have to assess UK and the risk in every step in the whole supply chain from back to front?
Yeah, absolutely. We get a schedule of values to know exactly, and we'll have a schedule of subsidiaries, and you would generally have multiple subsidiaries as co-insureds. And as part of our underwriting due diligence, we go through that schedule of values with a fine-tooth comb to make sure we understand exactly where all these assets are and what we're ultimately covering and what the prevailing risk dynamics, there could be different heads of cover or heads of perils that are applicable depending on where, Latin America, generally an SRCC concerning market. Whereas the Middle East at the moment, very clearly, we're concerned about war. So that's absolutely critical. And it's interesting, particularly when we think about perhaps some lessons learned that's going on at the moment in the war in the Middle East, for example, that is we're sort of amending how we think about underwriting as a result of that. Because, particularly when you talk about supply chains and we think about business interruption, one of the key, that's becoming evident is, these highly concentrated, large infrastructure assets, particularly in the petrochem space, they have very, very high unit economics. They have very concentrated production. And therefore, those supply chains don't have much resilience. Whereby, you talk about your coffee company, if you've got multiple different sites of production that feed into a central business model, you have much more resilience there and much more flexibility to port production depending on where's got excess capacity. So that's definitely an area that we're increasingly looking at. It's just how concentrated and what is the unit economics of that specific production site, and can you move it around essentially.
And I think just to add on to that, I think obviously when we're looking at supply chains as well, especially in the Middle East right now, we are seeing Iran target US military bases in each of these countries, right? They obviously have US ammunition, they have US arsenal. So now obviously Iran are looking to think, okay, how can we target not exactly in US, but Gulf states, neighboring Gulf states? For them, it's a lot easier to target than all the way sending attacks over to US, right? So So we are seeing obviously supply chains being affected all the way from the ground up, from the foundation all the way down up to the top.
And we're having to evolve our underwriting because war and how it's is changing, right? Historically, we do all this occupation analysis because we're very worried about, cruise missiles coming and taking out a specific asset. But what you're seeing now, certainly in the Middle East and definitely in Ukraine and increasingly now Russia as well, relatively rudimentary drones are causing a lot of damage. And also, you're having what I would describe as kind of indiscriminate collateral damage from missile defense systems and that debris then falling down. And that is quite hard to actually underwrite because it's not targeted, right? So our biggest defense there, we talked about how important Akash is on the exposure management side, is it's a kind of a fundamental insurance tenant. Pool your risk, right? Really diversify your risk. But then actually, rather than thinking about these huge, great multinational programs with lots of different assets, actually perhaps more desirable are smaller portfolios where we can really drill in and you can look at smaller assets, so smaller asset values in terms of vertical, but buying bigger stretches, so less first loss, less likely to be rapidly depleted. and where we got a real feel about, and we talked about the business interruption, where we can really get our hands and teeth into the business interruption and the supply chain. So it is constantly evolving, and we are really, we're seeing it play out now with what's going on in the Middle East.
Wow, yeah. All this stuff sounds really, really fascinating, really complicated, as you mentioned, and there's a lot of factors to think about.
Yeah.
But it just sounds so brilliant to must be like great to work in, and we'll come on to that very shortly. But something you just mentioned there around drones and warfare as well, it's clearly, as we talked about, the landscape has changed 30 odd years ago up to now, and that is primarily a relatively new form of warfare, a form of risk that I suppose you have to consider. Looking ahead to sort of the next 5 to 10 years or so, what do you think those sort of future risks will look like, and how do like insurers, brokers, etc., respond to those future risks?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to talk about war more generally, because that's definitely been the return of continental wars has been a real characteristic over the last 5 years. And, when we think about it, really the current turbulent state of the geopolitical landscape and really this sort of febrile background is concerning for us as underwriters. Concern really is acutely concerning when you think about the human cost of all of this. But in terms of how do we explain what's going on? Well, if you think following the Second World War, we had this sort of amazing period of really, a real, what I would describe as almost sort of a peace dividend, what's often you hear called a sort of Pax Americana, American peace. And that is the result of the US as a really unmatched global hegemon who was there to, unrivaled militarily powered, unrivaled economic, softer cultural power as well. And that was used to really promote free market capitalism and the associated stability and prosperity that came with it. And it was all underpinned by the web of what I would call multilateral organizations, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, and so what you hear called the rules-based order. The problem, though, with years of globalization is you've created some pretty formidable rival economies, most notably China. China's increasingly looking to sort of flex their muscles in their immediate spheres of influence. And, it is a little at odds when we really think about it, because, because of all this globalization, there's been a real hollowing out of industrial production in the US, as well as in Europe. And it's created this sort of fertile ground for the rise in populism that we're seeing. And, you saw President Trump, who's campaigned now on 2 occasions about increasing trade protectionism, declining role of multilateralism. But ostensibly, there's this sort of paradox between that backdrop and that discourse. And you look at the first half of this year alone, and the US has become involved in Venezuela. They've become embroiled in this sort of quagmire in the Middle East. And you think about what we all hope is just tantamount to continual saber ratting on Greenland, for example. That's totally at odds with a US policy that's meant to be America first, increasingly isolationist. But actually, when you really think, and when we bring it back to what is actually going on, this is a US foreign policy that still, there is still appetite for intervention, but it's short-term, ideally, strategic intervention that is focused on supply or accessing critical commodities, weakening key Chinese and Russian suppliers, and extracting maximum concessions. And we're seeing this play out across the world, but the concern for us as political violence and political risk and credit risk underwriters is the fact that, whilst positive that it's putting greater importance on Europe taking more responsibility for their security, the West has been underpinned by this collective deterrence, and a more unpredictable and less sort of erratic US foreign policy is a real risk. And when we think about how this impacts us from an insurance perspective, right? So, it's a double-edged sword. On the one side, never have we had more inquiries. The cadence of inquiries is we're inundated. Brilliant on the face of it. The problem, however, is if these, we talk about tectonics or these they rupture more frequently than we originally envisaged, or it's a competitive market, the supply of capital dictates the clearing price, then what is actually the economic price that we can charge, that impacts our profitability. So it is an incredibly interesting, but it is a little bit fraught with danger about where we find ourselves at the moment.
To be honest, it is actually really, really scary when you think about it in the future and how it is actually planning out literally as we speak. Yeah. As we speak, there's the ceasefire talks were going on, and now we're looking at US still attacking Iran and so on and so forth, right, back and forth. So we are seeing increase in geopolitical tensions, and there will be in future in the next 5-10 years and going on for no one knows how long, right? But then we are also looking on the sense of, which is also another prevalent risk, is obviously AI. So how do you keep AI up and running? And that's data service or data centers. So now you've got AI data centers all scattered around different regions all over the world globally. So now they are becoming targeted. So now you're thinking about how do you provide cover for AI data centers as well as anything to do with AI, right? So they are becoming more prevalent, as we say, and then obviously geopolitical tensions. It's finding that balance, and I think this is going to go on to the later questions of why I find political violence is so interesting, is because it's so unpredictable. You generally do not know what's going to happen next. Like I said, it's scary, but to be in this kind of market is understanding and seeing the scope of it. Is not having a really small lens. It's having a huge magnifying glass to see, okay, where do we target next? Like, how do we underwrite our business to make good underwriting?
Yeah, full marks to Akash for getting the old AI insurance bingo. He's got AI into a podcast.
You have to
drop it in.
It is right, because two factors with AI really specifically for terrorism. One is the fact that we are these massive growth, exponential growth in data center and build out. We're seeing so many huge requests, big vertical towers for terrorism, and lenders have to have terrorism insurance in order to make them bankable. So we're seeing inundated with requests, and that has its own aggregation and capacity challenges. But also we think more indirectly, the potential societal repercussions of if we do find ourselves with mass sort of disintermediation and possible job obsolescence down the line, what does that mean again in terms of SRCC and unrest and societal issues? So it's playing both in terms of a demand factor at the moment, but possibly it could well be a risk factor down the line as well.
Yeah, I mean, as you've said there, what big takeaway I've taken from that is you can't predict anything. It's completely unpredictable. Mm-hmm. And I assume there's, even going back to like the 90s, like you mentioned, America being the global hegemonic power there, the world police, as some people would call them at the time. And it slowly evolved into having the rise of China and Russia as well, and different other political players as well. I suppose with this area, you may have historical data to help support your underwriting. But when there is, like you said, mentioned about US foreign policy, you have a president now who, like you said, is a bit more interventionist, should we say, or we have seen examples of that. Whereas the next potential president that comes in may have a completely different policy. So there's so many different factors, economic, social, political, happening everywhere, all simultaneously, that there's no, that's definitely going to happen perfectly. You can assess and be ready for that because there's so many little factors or big factors that can change that along the way. So
yeah, we have to assess what the prevailing winds and where they're blowing, right? The one slight benefit, saving grace with terror and political violence versus, say, political risk, is the fact that the policy tenors are, broadly speaking, 1 year. Or for construction, they can be the length of the construction period, 3-4 years. Whereas in the political risk market, we're having to take 7, 10, 15-year views, depending on what the lending horizon or what the return period from an equity investor is. So much longer positions on a given sort of landscape, country or asset. So that requires even longer sort of projections. But you're right, it is still, there's a huge amount of uncertainty. And that's, as underwriters, that's ultimately our job to try and, understand it, price it and manage it.
So would you offer then policies to people who you think there might be, like you said, yearly ones there on offer, but there'd be ones that go over several years that you have to think well ahead of time and go, what do we do here? Or how do we assess that rather than taking it day by day or month by month, something small, you have to long term.
You have to position your book and in terms of your appetite to new business. But terrorism, like the majority of the Lloyd's and London market, is a renewal class. So you're mixturing the sort of cyclicality of renewals constantly coming through, whilst also inundated with new business opportunities, particularly when we find ourselves in the sort of, the headwinds that are currently going on. So it's a balancing act between new business and renewals.
Oh, brilliant. I always find this, I've found this already utterly fascinating. I studied international relations at university. Okay. So a little bit of this brings me memories back of university days as well. But it is really interesting and so much going on. Kind of already touched on it there, but I suppose, why do you both enjoy working in this sector so much? And would you personally recommend it to other people? Do you want to go first?
Yeah, of course. I think from my perspective, especially being in the market for 4.5 years, looking at terror quite a lot now, is we are now sort of moving away from conservative models to now thinking about, okay, how, like I mentioned, how do we model SRCC? How do we model war? right? In terms of, with the Ukraine and Russia happening, with no one knowing it was going to happen in the first place, for it to come into play, and you got like seized assets, seized aircrafts in Ukraine. How do you start to think about preparing for that kind of stuff, right? Obviously, from an underwriting perspective, they need exposure management. But from an exposure management perspective, how do we help underwriting? Obviously, we're not just a team that, we look at the exposure. Here's the exposure. You are within your limits, in your Lloyd's limits that you send to them. It's more so looking at your book and the portfolio and saying, okay, how can we help your team to make better underwriting? Or in that sense, like, okay, there could be potential for newer business in different regions that you really hasn't even touched upon yet. Right. So regionally, and I think the most important thing for me is that obviously when I wake up, there could be something that's happening on the news. For me, it's just, all right, there's a news article happening in the morning. In the afternoon, we have to create like an event response, or we have to create a report that has to be sent out to senior management and then eventually be sent out to the market. So it's that kind of transition of like, okay, never one day is the same. Right. And for me, that is really interesting and exciting. You don't want a role or something that you wake up and it could be quite boring and mundane. You want something that's interesting and you're always broadening your horizon, right? And there is plentiful of information out there. I would say there's just never enough.
Fantastic. Yeah, I completely agree with that as well.
Rousing words.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's very similar for me, right? I feel that kind of biased, but I think the Lloyd's or London market is just a brilliant place to apply your career. Be that underwriting, be that broking, be that sort of exposure management, particularly really agnostic of business or class of business. But if we particularly think about the political violence or the political credit risk lines of business, these are hugely relevant, front and center of what's going on in the world. You through, forging your career, get an excellent understanding of how the world works, current affairs, geopolitics, world trade, all these sort of things, right? And, it's a great blend between academics or rigorous academic interrogation of risk, which is hugely interesting. You then overlay the chance you forge really strong relationships with, it could be internal stakeholders, it could be with brokers, clients, other underwriters, and as we've talked about in political risk and political violence, these assets are often in pretty far-flung parts of the world. You get a great chance to go and see them and visit and travel. So it's just, again, I'm biased, but I just think it is a brilliant blend of things when it comes to a career.
It absolutely sounds, then from what you said to me, I completely agree. And having a job having a role that is not the same day to day, is always different. I think that's vital to keeping you interested, wanting to learn more and engage with a particular role. So that's really brilliant to hear from you both. And just to bring this podcast to a close now, final question, one takeaway for our audience from this podcast, what would it be? Should we start with you this time, James?
Okay. Well, I'll probably give you two. One is the fact that, this never has been a more pertinent time for the product. To borrow the well-known British broadcaster, it is live, in terms of the relevance. And also it's that final thing, right? In terms of it is a great career. It is an unmatched career. And, I know the CI is doing some great work at promoting and trying to get sort of more younger talent into the industry. It is such a great political violence, political risk, all specialty underwriting. It is a great place to be.
Fantastic, Jim. And Akash?
I think, from my perspective, like I said, I think I really need to hone in on like the learning capabilities, right? I think as you go through the market, you constantly want to learn. And the amount of possibilities out there in specialty lines of business, especially political violence and terror, the learning capabilities is unlimited. Right? There's so much to really look into and focus on. You can look at political violence in terms of SRCC. You can look at the war aspects. You can look at the terrorism aspects, right? Even more so, obviously, we talk about SRCC and war today. Even terrorism is still in the world. It's still here, right? We're now looking at pacers being blown up. Like no one would ever think about that kind of stuff, right? So it's thinking of, all right, news and affairs and current affairs and geopolitical tensions. But for me, it's more so just the learning capabilities. And I think you always want to broaden your knowledge out, and you definitely can in political violence and terror.
Fantastic. I mean, this has been an absolutely brilliant podcast, really interesting. I want to learn more. I feel like I've learned so much already speaking to you both. So this has been really good. So just to finish up, thank you both for joining me today. It's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you
very much.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
And thank you for listening to this episode of the Journal Podcast. You can find useful links in the show notes and related articles on the journal website, along with further podcasts, many of which can be logged as CPD with just one click. As always, please do like, review, and subscribe. And until next time, goodbye.